The stagecoach had not come in 3 hours, and Eleanor Vance had counted every minute of them, while the sun did its slow murder of the day. She stood on the warped boards of the depot platform in Crow's Hollow, a town that seemed less built than scabbed onto the desert, and she felt the heat lean against her like something with weight and intention. It was not the wet, smothering heat of a Boston August, the kind that hung in the streets like wash hung out to gray, the kind a body could outwait in the shade of a brick stoop with a glass of lemon water sweating in her hand. This was a dry and furious thing, a heat that came up off the hard pan and shimmering sheets and seemed to want something from her, seemed to be measuring how long she would last before she folded. Her traveling dress, a charcoal wool cut for the gray drizzle of New England, clung to her spine in a sheet of sweat. The fabric had been respectable once, chosen with care in a shop on a street where a woman could still pretend her fortunes were rising, where a clerk had unrolled the bolt across a polished counter and called it a fine and sober choice, and she had believed him the way you believe small, kind lies when the larger truth has not yet shown its teeth. Now it looked like a costume worn by a woman who had walked into the wrong story and could not find the door back out. Dust had settled into the seams of it, into the lace at her throat, into the fine lines of her palms, and she understood already that the dust here was not a thing you brushed away. It was a thing you learned to wear the way you learned to wear grief, by surrendering to it a little at a time until it became part of your own skin. The air smelled of horse manure baking on the road, of wood smoke, of something sweetly rotten behind the saloon, and underneath all of it, the dry mineral breath of a land that had never once in its long life loved anyone. A hot wind came up the street and rolled an empty tin can past her feet with a sound like a small bell, tolling for no one, and she watched it go and thought how everything out here seemed to be leaving, even the trash, even the light. She kept her chin level. She had learned long ago, in rooms far finer and far crueler than this depot, that a lifted chin cost nothing and bought a great deal, that the world read your spine before it read your face, and that a woman who would not bend was a woman. The world spent an extra moment deciding how to handle before it decided to leave her be. She had paid for that lesson dearly, and she meant to get her money's worth out of it now, here, at the bottom of everything. The letter that had carried her 2,000 miles was folded inside her glove, gone soft as cloth from 100 handlings, the creases worn nearly through to nothing, the ink faded at the folds where her thumb had rubbed it raw on the long nights when sleep would not come. It promised a husband, a man named Josiah Carver, a widower with land and a quiet temperament, and it had been arranged through an agency in St. Louis that took a woman's last dollars and her last illusions in a single, graceless transaction. The clerk there had not looked her in the eye. He had stamped her name and pocketed her money and slid the paper across the counter as though he were ridding himself of something faintly unclean, his fingertips never quite touching hers, and she had understood then exactly what she had become in the eyes of such men, a transaction to be completed and forgotten before the ink had dried. But Eleanor had no illusions left to sell, and she had counted that a kind of freedom, the only freedom left to a woman who had been stripped of every other kind. She had a brother buried in a pauper's row beneath ground that no one would tend dead, of a despair the world had handed him wholesale, sold to him cheap and certain. And she had stood at that bare patch of earth, alone in the rain, with no stone to mark it, and sworn a thing too large to say aloud. She had a name that men in fine offices had decided to ruined it with a few signatures and a few whispered words over brandy in rooms where the fire burned high and the carpet swallowed every footfall. And she had a small flat reticule, whose contents no one in this town could possibly guess, a thing she had carried against her body all the long miles of rail and stage as though it were the last warm coal of an old fire, a thing worth more than her life, and likely to cost her exactly that. So she waited where the letter told her to wait, beside a hitching rail silvered by sun, while men in dirty hats walked past and measured her the way they might measure a heifer at auction, their eyes lingering, calculating, dismissing. The wait stretched until the light went long and bronze, and the shadows of the false-fronted buildings reached across the street like grasping fingers, and the heat began at last to loosen its grip, only to hand her over to a colder thing creeping in behind it. No widower came, no wagon, no soft-spoken man, with a flower of apology in his hand and gratitude in his tired eyes. Instead, as the sun finally bled out behind the western ridges in a wound of orange and ash, a single rider came down the main street at a walk, and the town seemed to go quieter around him the way a room goes quiet when a debt walks in the door and looks around for the man who owes it. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten into a small, hard knot. Some instinct older than thought, older than reason, older than the long years of learning to read a room, told her that this man, whoever he was, had come for her, and that whatever he carried folded in his fist, it was not good news. He was not what the letter had described, and he was not soft, and there was nothing of apology anywhere on him. He sat the horse like a man grown out of it, like a thing that had always been there, tall and lean and weathered down to rawhide. And his coat was the color of dust, because everything out here eventually became the color of dust. The way every voice out here eventually became low, and the way every face eventually became a thing carved rather than born. A week of beard shadowed a jaw cut hard as a fence post, and the dust lay in the lines beside his eyes like silt settled in the bed of a dry creek. His hands were broad and scarred and easy on the reins, the hands of a man who had broken horses and dug graves, and known the full weight of both, and never once mistaken one task for the other. His eyes, when they found her, were a pale and startling gray, the gray of river ice in the last cold week before the thaw, and they did not crawl over her the way the other men's head did not strip her down to a price and a use. They simply took her in, full and direct, the way a man reads weather he means to ride through, weighing what it would cost him to cross it, and whether he had the grit to try. There was something in that plainness that unnerved her more than any leer, for it asked nothing and pretended nothing, and she had grown so used to men who wanted things that a man who only looked at her like a fact to be reckoned with felt almost like a stranger from another country. He swung down, without grace and without hurry, and the spurs at his heels made a small, dead chime against the boards, a sound that seemed too gentle for a man so hard, like a soft note struck on an instrument made for harsher music. He looked at her dress, at her thin city shoes, at the carpet bag at her feet that held everything she owned and almost nothing of worth, and something passed across his face that might have been weariness and might have been disappointment, and then was gone behind the stone of him like a fish gone back under dark water, leaving only a faint ring on the surface to say it had been there at all. He held a folded paper in one gloved fist, holding it the way a man holds a thing he does not relish handing over. "You'd be the Vance woman," he said. It was not a question, and his voice was low and gravel rough. A voice that did not seem to get much use, the worn voice of a man who spent his day speaking mostly to animals and to the wind and to the dead, and had near forgotten how it sounded, shaped around words meant for the living. "I am," she answered, and was glad her own voice held steady, and did not crack on the dryness in her throat, or the fear that had begun to coil cold beneath her ribs. "I was told I'd be met by Mr. Josiah Carver." The man's mouth tightened at one corner, an expression that had given up being a smile a long time ago, and had not yet decided what else to become. "Josiah Carver's been dead since the spring fever took him," he said. "He was my brother. I'm Eli Carver." He let the words sit in the dust between them, gave them room, as though he knew the size of what he was telling her, and would not rush her through it, would not crowd a body's grief or a body's reckoning. "He paid the agency before he passed. They sent you anyhow, took the money, sent the woman, didn't bother to mention the groom was in the ground." He unfolded the paper just enough that she could see it was no letter, no tender invitation, but a deed, a transfer of indenture and contract, her own name inked at the bottom in a clerk's careless hand, as though she were a parcel of land or a string of horses being moved from one column of a ledger to another and not worth the care of a straight line. The shame of it went through her like cold water poured down the back of her collar, sudden and total, raising every hair on her arms, but she did not let her eyes drop. She had been bought and sold before in fine rooms by men in finer coats, men who smiled while they did it and called it charity or marriage or business. And she had survived all of it, every transaction and every smiling theft. And she would survive this small, dirty one too. She made herself look at the paper. She made herself read her own name and feel nothing on her face. Gave the watching man nothing of the storm behind it, though somewhere beneath that calm, a small voice in her was screaming the way it always screamed and had long ago learned to scream where no one could hear. Eli Carver watched her absorb the blow and not fall under it, watched her swallow it whole, and stand there still upright in her ruined wool with her chin level, and the smallest flicker of something crossed those ice-gray eyes. Not pity. He had no use for pity, and neither, he sensed at once, did she. Something harder and more useful than pity. The first faint recognition of a thing that did not break, of a kind of iron he understood because he carried it himself. The same iron a hard life had hammered into him, and respected because the world had tried so often and so cruelly to bend it out of him and had not yet managed it. "There's no buggy," he said after a moment, as though that were the worst of it, as though the death and the deed had been the easy part, and now they had come to the real trouble of getting her where she was bound. "Axel cracked 2 days back, and the Smiths drunk till Sunday. Won't sober for love nor coin. I've already asked him twice, and he only laughed at me from the floor." He looked at her shoes again, the thin city leather already scuffed white at the toes, never meant for anything rougher than a swept parlor floor or a carpeted stair. "It's a horse, or it's nothing, and night's coming on fast, and you don't want to be in this town after dark in those clothes, with that face, alone. It's a long ride. Cold, once the sun's gone, colder than you'd credit, the kind of cold that gets into a person and stays. You'll want to decide quick." A lesser man might have offered to wait, to find a room above the saloon, to spare her the indignity of the dark and the saddle and the long, cold miles. He offered nothing but the truth, lay bare and ungentle, and somehow that was its own strange courtesy, a respect that did not pretend she was too delicate to hear how things truly stood, that did not wrap a hard fact in soft cloth and hand it to her like she was a child or a fool. Eleanor looked past him at Crow's Hollow, at the saloon spilling its yellow light and its stink of whiskey and desperation into the rutted street, at the men watching her from the shadowed porches, like coyotes watching a stray that had not yet decided which way to run and would not run far. She thought of the locked compartment in her reticule and what it would mean if the wrong hands found it, and she knew with cold certainty that the men who hunted her would not be far behind, that they had money enough to buy any room and any silence, and that a woman alone, in a town like this, was a woman already half taken before she ever felt the hand close. The choice was no choice at all, and she had made harder ones with less time and worse company. Then she bent, lifted her own carpet bag, before he could reach for it, the weight of it familiar and steadying in her hand, and said, "Then we'd best not waste the light." Something shifted in his weathered face, some old assumption falling away like a stone loosed from a wall. He had expected weeping, or refusal, or the brittle outrage of a woman who believed the world owed her gentleness and had come west to collect on the debt. He had not expected her to simply pick up her bag and choose the hard road without a single word of complaint, as though hard roads were nothing new to her. He took the bag from her hand, not unkindly, his fingers brushing hers for half a moment, rough leather against worn glove, and turned to the horse without another word, and she followed, and the day died around them as they went. The town fell away behind them into a smear of lamplight, and then into nothing at all, swallowed whole by the dark, and the wilderness opened up around them like the floor of a drained ocean, vast and silent and waiting. She rode behind him on the big bay, her gloved hands fixed at the back of his belt, because there was nowhere else honorable to put them, and the warmth of him through the dust-colored coat was the only warm thing in a world going swiftly and bitterly cold, the only fixed point in a darkness so total it seemed to swallow the very ground beneath the horse's hooves. The desert at night was a different country than the desert by day, harder and stranger, and somehow more honest, as though the daylight had been a lie, the land told, and the dark was the truth it kept underneath. The heat lifted off the land in slow waves. She could feel against her face like the breath of some great sleeping animal, and behind it came a chill that crept up out of the arroyos and settled into her thin wool like water, into a sinking boat. claiming her inch by inch, fingers first, then wrist, then the small of her back where the sweat had dried cold. Above them, the sky cracked open into more stars than she had ever known existed, a wild, careless scatter of them flung from horizon to horizon, cold and white and indifferent to every small human trouble that crawled beneath them, more stars than the close brick sky of Boston had ever allowed her to imagine. And she tipped her head back once and felt something in her chest both break and mend at the sight of them. Coyotes spoke to each other across the dark miles in voices that climbed and broke and yipped and made the hair stand up along her arms, and somewhere far off an owl cut the silence once and went quiet again. Eli Carver said nothing. For a long time, asked her nothing, told her nothing, made no attempt to fill the dark with talk. He rode the way he did everything, with an economy that wasted no motion and no breath, his head turning now and again to read the dark ridgelines, his whole body a quiet instrument tuned to threat, listening to the night the way she might once have listened to a difficult silence in a difficult room, hearing things in it that she could not. She found against all reason that his vigilance steadied her. A man so watchful was a man who meant to arrive, a man who would not let the dark have her cheaply, nor let any harm come to her cargo or her person without first spinning himself against it. And she let herself lean a fraction closer into the warmth of his back, and told herself it was only the cold, and almost believed it, and was glad he could not see her face to know the rest. Once, near a dry creek, where a few cottonwoods made a black tangle against the stars, he reined in and stepped down and lifted a canteen from the saddle. He drank first, then held it up to her without a word, and she understood the gesture was its own kind of trust, an offering made and not explained, for a man who drank first was a man telling you the water was not poisoned and his hand was not against you. She took it. The water was warm and tasted of tin and of the long day, and it was the finest thing she had ever swallowed in all her life, finer than any wine, in any glittering Boston dining room, where the crystal had thrown back the chandelier light and the men had smiled their thieves' smiles over the rims of their glasses. "Cold's worse than the heat out here," he said, looking not at her, but at the dark line of the hills, as though they might be listening and he meant them to know he was watching. "Heat just wants to slow you down. Cold means it. Cold's got no mercy in it, and no hurry either." He pulled a heavy wool blanket from behind the cantle and handed it back to her, the wool smelling of horse and of him, and she drew it around her shoulders and felt the blood and the sense return slowly to her numb fingers like a tide creeping back into a flat. "Sorry for the ride," he said, and the words came out of him stiff and rusted, like a gate that had not been opened in years, and protested every inch of its swing. Wasn't how it was meant to go, for you or for him. She understood, in that moment, with a clarity that surprised her, that he was apologizing for a brother who could not, for a death that had cheated them both of different things, for a world that took a woman's money and gave her a corpse and a stranger and called the account settled and closed the book. "You didn't make the world cruel, Mr. Carver," she said quietly, her voice carrying soft across the cold dark between them. "You're only living in it, same as me. Same as everybody who ever got handed a thing they didn't ask for and had to make a life out of it anyhow." He looked at her then, full on, those river ice eyes catching the starlight and holding it, turning it over as though her words were a thing he had not heard in longer than he could rightly remember, as though somewhere in him a door he had thought nailed shut had given a little under the weight of them. For a long breath, neither of them said anything at all, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers held apart by a clerk's careless deed, but something newer and more fragile. A silence that was beginning, very carefully, to listen, the way a man leans his ear toward a sound he is not yet sure he heard. Then he climbed back into the saddle, and they rode on, and the blanket held his warmth and hers together against the dark. The homestead, when they reached it deep in the night with the moon halfway down the sky, was nothing to comfort a city woman's heart. A low cabin of squared logs crouched against the dark swell of a hill, with a barn and a corral, and a windmill that turned slow and creaking in the night air like the hand of a tired clock, counting out hours no one would ever spend, hours that piled up empty in a lonely place. There was no garden, no curtain in any window, no soft thing anywhere her eye could find. only the spare, honest geometry of a place built by hard hands to outlast the man who built it. Every line of it bent toward endurance, and none of it toward comfort. Eleanor's heart sank, and she did not bother to hide it, for she was too tired now to wear the mask, too cold and too far from anything she had ever called home. And Eli saw the sinking pass across her face in the moonlight and did not apologize again, for he had run out of apologies somewhere on the dark road and would not offer her a false one to fill the space. Instead, he led the horse past the dark main house and onto a smaller cabin set apart beneath a single twisted oak, whose bare branches scratched faintly at the stars, and he pushed the door open on a room that was clean and swept and laid with a narrow bed neatly made, the blanket squared at the corners by a hand that had taken care over it. A fire already burned low in the small stone hearth, throwing its amber light across the chinked log walls, and a covered plate of biscuit and cold venison waited on the rough table beside a pitcher of water, beaded with cool. He had prepared all of it before he ever rode for town, she realized, with a slow turning in her chest, prepared it carefully and in advance for a stranger. He had every reason in the world to resent and turn away and leave to the mercy of the agency that had wronged them both. Then he showed her the thing that undid her composure more thoroughly than any cruelty ever could have. He pointed to the heavy iron bolt fixed to the inside of the door, dark and solid and new, the wood around it still pale, where the auger had bitten. "Locks from your side," he said. "Not mine. You barred at night, and no man on this earth comes through that door. Me least of all, you've my word, for whatever a stranger's word buys you out here." He set her bag inside the door, touched the brim of his hat, and walked out into the cold dark, and she stood listening to his boots, crossed the frozen yard, and to the soft sound of the latch on the big house dropping into place, and she understood that she had just been handed the one thing she had not dared hope for in 2,000 miles of running and watching and sleeping with one eye open. Safety. Offered freely, not demanded in return for anything, not held over her head as a debt to be repaid in coin or flesh or silence. A door that locked against the very man who held the paper that claimed to own her, and she stood a long while with her hand on that cold iron before she could make herself believe it. And when at last she did believe it, she sat down on the edge of the narrow bed and wept the way a body weeps, only when it has finally been allowed to set down a weight too long carried. The days that followed wove themselves into a quiet rhythm, a thing built of habit and small kindnesses rather than words, for he was a man who hoarded words like a miser hoards coin, spending them only when no gesture would do the work instead. Dawn she woke in the cold blue light to find provisions left on her step without a knock and without a face, a tin of milk still warm from the cow, brown eggs nested in straw, once a fistful of late wildflowers laid atop the eggs, purple and gold, and already wilting at the edges, that he never once mentioned and she never once asked about, though. She pressed one of them between the pages of her father's old book and kept it there like a thing she could not afford to lose. She watched him from her small window as the autumn deepened and the grass went gold and the morning sharpened toward frost. She watched him work the land from the first gray light until the stars came out, splitting wood with a rhythm steady as a heartbeat, mending the long miles of fence with wire that bit his hands raw, gentling a half-broke colt in the corral with a patience that seemed to belong to an entirely different man than the hard one who had read her name off a deed in the dust of Crow's Hollow. He was gruff with people. On the rare days people came riding up the long track, and tender with animals in a way that gave him away, that told the truth of him underneath the stone. And once, on a still gray afternoon, when the light lay flat and colorless over everything, she saw him stand a long while at a low mound of stones beneath the oak, hat in his weathered hands, his head bowed, and his broad shoulders bent low under a grief he showed no living soul. And she knew without being told that his wife lay there beneath those stones, and that the silence in him was not coldness, but a wound that had never been allowed to close, a hurt walled up, so it could not be touched or healed. Her fear of him thinned and changed, the way river ice changes when the season turns, into watchfulness, and then into something gentler that she did not yet dare to name, even to herself in the dark. She began to reclaim her own small kingdom within the four clean walls. She scrubbed the cabin bright, set the wildflowers in a tin cup on the sill, and at last took out the fine engraved pistol she had carried 2,000 miles, wrapped in her shawl, the one her father, the gunsmith, had pressed into her hands and taught her to shoot before the world decided that a woman's hands were good only for needlework and folded prayer. She cleaned it and oiled it by the firelight and felt, with each familiar motion, the click of the action and the smell of the oil. Herself, become herself again, the woman she had been before the world set out to unmake her. One morning she left a mended shirt folded on his porch, his torn work shirt that she had quietly taken from the line and stitched whole again in the long evenings by the lamp. And she understood as she set it down that it was not subservience, was not the gesture of a bought woman earning her keep, but a signature, a way of saying without words that she was a person who makes and mends and gives of her own free will, and not a thing that any man had ever bought or could buy. He found her by the corral on a morning when the first hard frost lay silver and brittle on the grass, their breath smoking in the still air, and he had the deed in his hand. Without ceremony, without a speech, he knelt at the cook fire and fed the paper to the coals, and they both stood and watched her name curl and blacken and lift away as smoke into the colorless dawn sky, gone forever beyond the reach of any clerk or court. "You're not property," he said, and his rusted voice was steady and low. "Never was to me. You're free to go come spring, free to go this hour, if you've a mind. I'll not hold any living woman to a dead man's bargain." That was the morning the riders came, 3 of them on lathered horses, hard men from the syndicate that had ruined her family in Boston and tracked her all the way west across 2,000 miles to silence what she carried. The ledger sewn into the lining of her reticule that named every corrupt official and every stolen dollar, and would hang the lot of them if it ever reached the right hands and the right judge. They came shooting, no warning and no parley, and the cold, clear day cracked wide open with gunfire and the screaming of frightened horses, and Eli Carver hauled her down behind the corral wall and pressed his old rifle into service, his face gone flat and certain. And she drew the engraved pistol from the folds of her skirts and answered fire with a marksman's calm that stopped him cold for half a heartbeat as he turned and saw, all at once, who she truly was beneath the ruined wool and the city manners. They fought as if they had fought together all their lives. No words needed and none wasted. Her voice calling out a flanker working through the brush that he could not see from his side of the wall, his broad hand steering her clear of a charging horse without ever taking his eyes off his sights. 2 bodies moving as one single will across the frozen ground. When the smoke finally cleared and drifted off on the cold wind, and the 3 men lay still and dark in the silvered frost, she was shaking down to the bone, and he was bleeding from a furrow the lead had cut across his arm, and inside the warm cabin where she bound the wound, with strips torn from her own ruined city dress. He told her at last about the wife the fever had taken in the spring, the words coming slow and broken out of a place long sealed, each one costing him, and she told him in turn about the brother in the pauper's row and the men who had put him there, and the high cold walls that had stood so long between them came down quietly, stone by stone, 2 on the steady firelight. By the time spring came green over the hills and the wildflowers returned to the slopes, she had not slept a single night in the small cabin in many weeks, and the homestead had 2 voices in it now, and laughter where there had been only the creak of the windmill. And the wheel turned over a place that was a home at last, and not merely a place built to outlast its builder. One cold night had asked of him everything a man could give, and he had given it, signed over, not on any paper that a clerk could stamp or a fire could burn, but in the deeper and truer ledger of a heart that had decided, against all the hard arithmetic of this hard and lonely land, to open itself once more and live again.